Welcome to Mental Health Without Borders, the Global Wellness Podcast with Dr. Lindsay Frey, where we dive into the complexities of mental health from a global perspective, exploring how different cultures approach wellness and what we can learn from one another. This episode is sponsored by Finding Hope Wellness Center in Tampa, Florida, where individuals, families, and couples can go to receive hope and healing for their mental health. Go to www.findinghopewellnesscenter.com to find out more. In this rich and deeply insightful episode, I welcome Hannah-Valeria Grishko, an internationally recognized psychotherapist and certified trauma specialist whose career has spanned the United States, Ukraine, the UK, France, and Israel. With decades of experience and a passion for trauma-informed care, grief work, and Jungian Sandplay Therapy, Hannah-Valeria brings a powerful lens to emotional healing across cultures. Hannah-Valeria's therapeutic work is grounded in deep presence, symbolic exploration, and cross-cultural understanding. Her motto, it's never too late to start anything. Whether she's speaking at a global conference, supervising therapists, or supporting clients of all ages, Hannah-Valeria's approach is relational, soulful, and rooted in hope. Welcome to Mental Health Without Borders. It's so nice to be able to speak with you again today, Hannah-Valeria. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you. I'm well. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, me too. It was such a great conversation the first time that I spoke with you. And I do want to say before we get started, something I was taken by the first time I talked to you was your really positive energy. And you have this kind of light about you that's really infectious. I can tell that you would really work well with clients with that level of energy. And I just want to say that because it was a pleasure and I really looked forward to talking with you again today. So thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So can you start by sharing a little bit about your personal journey, where you're from, where life has taken you? Because as I said in the introduction, it's taken you to many places, and what it was like navigating the process of immigration adaptation across countries. I'm sure a lot of people are interested in that.
So I was born in Ukraine and my family immigrated to the United States when I was 15 and a half, almost 16. And first place of landing was Little Vermont, right in the north of the United States, a beautiful state, but very different, very, very different from Kyiv, where I was born. And then I spent some time studying. I went to the University of Chicago for my graduate degree, to New York University to NYU for my master's because I wanted to become a therapist, and worked for some years in New York until I decided it was time to travel. It was time to explore. It was time to come back to things I was looking for. It was time to connect to things that I wanted to connect to. And so that's when my travel journey began. It began by moving to France and then the United Kingdom, where I lived for quite some time. And now I'm in Israel. I think you're really asking a very interesting question. I think it's a really important question. And I think because when we often think about immigration or we work with clients that have been immigrants themselves, we don't always think about a sort of where that immigration happened and where that fits within the context of a client's life. And so I think your question I thought it was really meaningful in the sense that when I moved this the first time, when I moved from Kyiv, Ukraine to the United States, it was very challenging. I mean, I was an adolescent, and anybody who works with adolescents, anybody who remembers themselves as adolescents, who has adolescents, might recall that it can be a very turbulent time because in many ways, there's that process of separation from your family of origin, and there's that intense kind of formulation and coming into yourself and your own identity through your social networks, your social circle, through the world around you. And when all of a sudden that world is pulled away from you, it's very difficult. It's very, very challenging. I always remember Vermont and coming to the United States very fondly because people were so kind to me. They were so nice to me and so helpful and so kind. But I also remember how hard it was for me just to really connect and to find roots or learn to understand how this culture worked. Because, oh boy, it was different to what I was used to and to that cultural language. I think this is something I find that in every country you live or in the culture you live, you have to learn the cultural language. You may not like all of it, but you do have to know what it is because otherwise you're not talking the same language with people around you. So, but then of course, when I moved to France, London and Israel, and each one of them brought a different piece to my own life and to my own sense of becoming myself, that search for meaning, that search of wholeness. I think each country brought, each period of time in that country had brought something very unique and different, but it was very different because it was no longer an adolescent. And I was now making a choice. This is often something when I work with parents who have adolescents or children who are moving or are expats or immigrants, is that need to acknowledge that all kids don't make a choice to move. Adolescents don't make a choice to move. And so that has to be worked with somehow. That has to be acknowledged and processed. And because that can really add to that feeling of lack of control.
Absolutely. And I think being 15, like you said, I do work with a lot of adolescents. So it's a lot. I really respect what you said about making sure you're acknowledging that the teenager's not making the choice, that they're going along with this big choice and this difference, and really intentionally helping them navigate that and adjust to it, and doing your best to understand that experience of being a teenager, which also just comes with its own language too, right? It's like being a teenager. You have your own slang, you have your own way, you have your own situation. And so shifting that to a brand new culture as a teenager is a lot.
For sure. And it's all these layers of language, right? So you just mentioned yourself that adolescents have their own language, and there's the cultural language, and then there's the language of the family, right? Each family is going to be different. Each family has their own way of addressing things, maybe not always addressing things or talking about things, or what meaning they attribute. Yeah. So I often find that when I work with parents, families and parents, they very consciously, intentionally want the best. And they might have made the move for the best reasons. And they're absolutely right within their own way. But that may not be necessarily be felt and experienced in the same way by the children or the adolescents. So
Yes. And so acknowledging that, asking the right questions, right? Taking care of that. And so, how did those early cross cultural experiences influence your decision to become a therapist? I know a lot of people, their own journey can kind of lead them into this field. And so, did it shape that experience and shape the way you support clients today as well?
yes, absolutely. Very much so. I think in that sense, there are many people like me, as you say, there are many people's their personal journey impacts why they become therapists. Very much so. I suppose on a very surface level, the challenges of immigration, the challenges of adapting, the challenges of finding one's own place, finding, ground under my feet, like needing to do that, that definitely alerted me to the whole inner reality, to the whole other reality of my own inner kind of world. And that sometimes it can be a very hard place to be and can feel very lonely when you're in this amazing place and everybody seems to be so welcoming and supportive. And you almost like have to pretend to be happy sometimes because you almost feel like, you have no reason not to be happy, but yet you don't feel happy. But of course, what living in the United States has opened for me is this whole other culture of mental health and the whole culture where mental health is acknowledged, where mental health is talked about, where people seek help, and that's accepted and that's more than okay. And when I went to college, when at the University of Chicago, I realized that there were others around me who saw therapists, and that therapy was a way of that people seeked to feel better, to find themselves, to achieve their goals, to work towards something that they wanted in life. And then there was actually something you can do and something you can learn how to do. And so I thought that was rather extraordinary. And then I seek my own therapy, as I'm sure you can almost expect me to say at this point. It was an eye opener for me. And I really wanted to explore that. So I majored in psychology as I was already in university. I also really was curious about why also was very interesting to me to go into the kind of to think about my own cross cultural experiences becoming a therapist is that I also recognized that moving had opened up this whole world to me of different cultural experiences and different cultures, and that the context matters. We often think about kind of different therapists. We as therapists often talk about the different approaches. What should we focus on? Is it CBT? Is it systemic? What's more important? What's more? But I think I always joke about it. It's not really a joke, is that it takes about one day in the life of an immigrant, if you're an immigrant, to understand that context does matter. Cultural context matters, social context matters, religious context matters, everything, all of these things add to a new different experience. There was an eye-opening experience because I've lived all my life in Ukraine. I was in my context and it made sense to me because I grew up in it. And all of a sudden, context changed completely. So I think from the very beginning, I began to be interested in that dialogue between the inner and the outer, that dialogue between myself and what's happening on the outside and how do you relate to it. So that was definitely a big, big factor. And of course, being in the United States, being in Chicago, being in college, other people around me also from different places, different parts of the United States, also from different countries. So you realize this is a very universal situation. So that also, of course, made life much more. It made me feel like I wasn't some a unique character, in Vermont, but I was amongst people who have had similar experiences. And this is part of life. And this is part of life in the societies on our planet. In many ways, can be a very universal experience because, of course, also in the United States, even if somebody is born in the United States, maybe their parents have come from somewhere, or maybe their grandparents have come from somewhere. So even being surrounded by kind of US born Americans, I realized, they also had a connection sometimes to a place that's not always only United.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
These were really eye opening experiences for me.
Yes, so really broadening your worldview and getting to know people with similar experiences. So, in one sense, it normalizes it. It normalizes it, but also you understand it in a broader way, which I'm sure just brought so much insight from your own experience and then probably hearing from other people and learning about their experience and saying, this is a real thing we need to pay attention to. And how do we help people adjust to this? And are we helping people adjust to this and paying attention to it? I want to go back to one thing you mentioned because you've mentioned your interest in the dynamic between the internal emotional world and the external cultural environment that we live in. Can you talk a little bit about how those two interact, especially in times of major transition for anyone that's listening that maybe has also gone through that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. It's an important question I think a lot about all the time. I thought about it then, obviously I continue to do so because I work with people that do it all the time. You see, I think that major transition and upheaval will really pull on your resources. They really pull on your emotional resources. And obviously, the more you have, more of them that you feel you're connected to, then the easier these transitions and these emotional upheavals can be. I think it really pulls on your motivation. It really challenges you in terms of how much do you want this really? Do you really want this transition? And if you're already in a new place, well, you're already here. So what helps you to stay motivated? What carries you through difficult moments? Because there will be difficult moments, no matter how idyllic and how, perfect the place you think you're in. Remember some time ago reading about the suicide rates in Switzerland, and I remember thinking on a kind of intuitive level, I thought, my God, like, how is this even possible? That's a perfect little place. No crime, no nothing. It's just beautiful, insanely beautiful. And yet people suffer everywhere. So I think also, how flexible and rigid your inner world, how much you're able to adapt, how much you're able to consider, that something that's new is not necessarily bad. Something is different isn't necessarily, it may not feel comfortable in the moment. I think that needs to be acknowledged, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily intrinsically bad. And the more that you're able to move in that space, I think the easier that transition can be, or at least an appreciation of that transition or appreciation of this new place that you're in. Because sometimes it does take time for people to adjust. It does take people to because what you're needing to do is not just adjust as in like you're functioning, because of course that's also an important level in life. You need to be functioning most of the time. But do you feel at home? Do you feel at least somewhat at home? Or do you at least feel at home in some areas of your life? To have you come into this new place of identity? And I think this is something sometimes we don't talk about enough because we forget that moving to a different place will bring up parts of or questions around our identity, or maybe parts of our identity that's been pushed aside from our kind of like conscious standpoint, or kind of the part of ourselves that we don't use as the most. And that can take time. It's a different conversation, you know,
Hmm.
but important conversation, I think.
And so you're saying, if I hear you right, if your foundation is very strong in who you are, you know yourself to be, your strengths, your weaknesses, your challenges, your triggers, reactions, your coping, the stronger that foundation of self awareness is and who you are, then that can help your adjustment. You're saying,
For sure. And also how flexible you can become. Remember reading about somebody who had moved from the United States to France, and they were writing about how difficult everything was, how people didn't have the same kind of social banter that happens all the time in the United States. But yes, that's true. That's not going to sound the same. There's a social conversation going on, but it's going to sound different. And so if you're going to expect that it's going to be the same, that's going to be painful because it's not going to be the same. That's what I mean by this flexibility and expectation and an allowing that things can be different, will be different probably, but they are also can be wonderful in their own way. They're just different.
Yes, and that's why I like something that you said. I want to pull it out and emphasize it that you said in a roundabout way, just because it's hard doesn't mean it's bad. So a lot of times we run from things that are hard, going, oh, this is a bad thing. I have a bad feeling, bad emotion from it. I'm going to go versus I'm going to move towards it because it is a good thing and it can be a good thing. I read something similar recently that was talking about flexibility and adaptability just as inner characteristics, and that these are some of the most important characteristics for people that want to be successful in any area of their life that they want to be successful in is flexibility and adaptability. And I thought that was great because those are things that we can learn how to control and manage, just being flexible and adaptable.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes people need support with that. You see, sometimes people will say, I can't do it. I won't do it. I want to have the same social conversation that I had before, and I won't go to dinner party because I don't understand. And sometimes people need support. People need help. Maybe they need somebody to go help them into that social scene. But I think it's important to remember that because sometimes people, when they move, will already move. Sometimes you can go back, but sometimes it's not possible for all kinds of reasons. So in a kind of day-to-day life, we can run away from feeling bad, feeling hard, for example, or a difficult feeling, right? Sometimes when you have practically moved yourself across the world, you can't exactly move back. I mean, you asked me about my own story, and I remember thinking about one of the things that I was thinking about that as something I incorporate in my work is this: sometimes life will happen that you don't have control over. And at 15, it was a very hard lesson, but it is true. As I moved and as I lived and as I worked with clients, I realized this actually is a fact of life. So if we can accept that, and you don't have to like it all the time, but if you can accept it, then your whole relationship to it will change. And then it is your relationship to the fact that things have changed is what's going to drive the whole story. No longer that it had changed.
Mhm. Yes. And if somebody is listening, I hope that they're taking some of this into consideration. If you have transitioned, if you've moved in the States, if you've moved across Europe, if you've had that transition and you're struggling with it, know that other people struggle with it too and reach out for support and help. There are therapists that are willing, able, and excited to be able to help you through this journey, to be able to help you with the adjustment for where you are now. You don't have to stay stuck. You don't have to be unhappy where you are. There is a way to see through it. So that would just be a pause for anybody that is struggling with some of the things that we're talking about to reach out for help. There are therapists that are there to help you. And just speaking of adapting and shifting in a new phase of life, you've worked extensively with grief and trauma in the work that you do. And in your experience, how does unresolved loss, whether it be personal or cultural, even impact somebody's ability to adapt, belong, or heal in a new place?
Think this is such an important topic. I wish I could probably talk about this for hours. David Kessler, who is a very well-known grief specialist. I feel like he's given me permission to say it because I've quietly thought about this before. But when you have somebody so famous say that, you feel kind of encouraged and supported by that. And he often says, we live, and I think he means it in a much greater sense. I don't think he means specifically United States or Western Europe, but he means it in general, that we live in a kind of grief illiterate societies. Not in the sense that we don't know what grief is, that we understand conceptually, like what it is and what that means, and that, but in the sense of one is really appreciating the complexity of feelings that really emerge in that process, and that it really takes time. It really takes time. And the stages of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross were never meant to be a linear progression from point A to point B. They meant to kind of give us a kind of a general map to something to think about, that people will move on it through it in a unique way. But that also takes time. DSM puts a very specific time frames of what is what. But people don't always fit that. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with the way that they grieve. And the other thing that I think is particularly important with immigrants, which because it's a different kind of loss, you see, and in the sense that it's not a physical loss, right? So nobody died. And people will say to me, oh gosh, don't even say that word. Nobody died. Of course, I wasn't thinking about the physical death. I'm thinking about the loss of identity, or the loss of comfort, or the loss of familiarity, or the loss of yourself as you knew yourself before. Perhaps if you're professionally, established in a place where you were before, maybe you're in a different place and you're no longer licensed to practice medicine, psychology, pharmacy, right? And so you're no longer the therapist, doctor, or whoever. And that I think is some of this dangerousness, this people like to call this encapsulated loss, is that these feelings that are felt to be unacceptable. That can also, of course, happen in other situations of loss and grief. I'm not saying it only happens with immigration, but since we're on the topic of cross-cultural and immigration and moving, and it almost like gets pushed aside. And I like this word encapsulated because I have this image of a capsule. And so it's like it pushed aside and it's almost as though it doesn't exist. And we can be really fooled into thinking that that isn't playing a part and why the person may be feeling anxious, depressed, can't make friends, doesn't feel good, doesn't feel settled, can't quite, seems to function, but doesn't feel happy. So this is something very often the people come and say, well, on the books, on the paper, I'm okay, but I don't feel good. I can't settle into anything. I think that's really, really important to think about, that grief is complex, it's very unique. And I think as therapists, and I'm also going back to David's words, a therapist can help people to both grieve fully and to live fully, because grieving robs people of life. When it becomes to such degree, grieving is healthy, it's completely understandable. That's what we do when we experience loss. But when it gets to a point where you're no longer living past a certain point, that's when I think we as therapists have to be really aware of that. And to be able to think this is what I mean, to accept that grief is there, but that life is also here. And so, no, things living in the United States will never be like they were for me at V14 in Ukraine. That can never happen, right? So it's both and, because I think sometimes we take this position as therapists that we have to help people adjust, we have to help them kind of adapt. And I think sometimes very kind of unconsciously, we sort of a little bit push their feelings out of the way or push that attachment to their place of origin or a place or another country where they've been before, that they feel a particular sense of, with expats, there's often, there's multiple places people live. There's often a country that people feel like, oh, that was so wonderful, that was so great, but my husband no longer has the job and we had to leave. I wish we didn't have to leave. That we don't push those, so we don't sometimes, kind of gently but unconsciously push those feelings away for people, but that allow them to have them. But that I think the focus really needs to be allowing them, also helping them to live really fully where they are.
Yeah. And that's a really powerful. There's going to be so many powerful quotes that come from this episode because I think people need to hear that it's complex. Grief is unique. Grief is personal. And that therapists can teach you both how to grieve and then learn how to live again. I think that that's really, really beautiful, that healing is possible, and it is. And sometimes we need help for it. But acknowledging the complexity of it, acknowledging how personal it is for somebody, that it may not be in the linear way as how we've learned about the grief process, but that we also need to pay attention to life that's happening around us as well. And so I think that that's beautiful and very, very important work that you do. And I think too, when we're talking about healing and just the universal experience of healing, you have worked across continents. We've worked in different countries. You have worked with children, adults, and families per your bio. And so are there any common emotional threads that you have noticed, regardless of location or language, when we're talking about the human experience of healing?
In many ways, I will be drawing another part of my kind of specialty work in terms of my therapy practice. But, I'm drawing a little bit from what Jungian psychology offers us. I remember hearing this many, many years ago, and I sort of thought, I'm like, oh, okay, this sounds like it makes sense, but I didn't really think much about it. But I've learned over time, you're talking about something universal and something that I kind of move the thread across, all my practice in different countries that I work, is that when given right conditions for healing, when given the right setting, I don't mean just the physical setting, of course, that's a whole setting, it's a whole image, the psyche will move towards balance. And I kind of thought it was, well, I didn't think anything of it, but actually it seems so simple, but it isn't really, if you think about it, because that means that psyche has an incredible capacity to regenerate and to, we know now much more about neuroplasticity of the brain, right? We love, there's a whole field of psychology and psychotherapy now, brain development and how we work with different therapies, especially focused on trauma, such as, EMDR and somatic experiencing, all this very useful and very helpful approaches, they take into account and they work with the brain. And so in that sense, this is a different, you might not be using the word or it might not be using the image of the brain, but I think that this speaks to that same level of neuroplasticity, of regeneration, of capacity to grow. And I think there's also something in us as therapists. It's a very different position because, if we're coming into this room with people that we're going to fix them, we're going to apply strategies. And I'm not saying I'm all for strategies. There's time for that too, focus plans and strategies and addressing certain things and having goals. I'm all for that, but there are times where we have to also remember that can be very helpful, but sometimes it isn't enough. And I think sometimes that also means that giving the client the space, giving them the boundary, having the boundaries, of course, but also having clients the space to be able to really explore things and to be able to be exploring things, to acknowledging things, to learning things, to feeling feelings in that space without us being so directive. Dora Kopp, the founder of Jungian Sandplay Therapy, which, I also practice, she always talked about that, a client has to come into a room. I don't remember the quote exactly, but she talked about how the client has to come into a room with the therapist and the therapist has to offer an empty space inside of himself or herself. And I think what she meant is not that we feel empty, but that we have a space inside of ourselves that's open for the client, that isn't filled only with our thoughts and feelings and ideas and plans and strategies and all of those things. And I think that for me definitely is something that Carrie have noticed and I've seen throughout my work in all of these different places, And I think in life, we don't only live in therapy, right? We also live lives. And I think in life, what does that mean to have this sort of right conditions for healing? I feel that it means having a supportive environment where the person feels seen and heard. And I know that sounds very simple. People might say, well, this is easy, but actually it isn't that easy because very often people are not seen and heard. And very often we ourselves don't see and hear ourselves, never mind other people. But to be really truly acknowledged and be seen and be kind of given space to be in kind of an entirety of who you are, I think that's incredibly healing. And I do think it really moves across cultures, across cultural languages, at least in my experience.
Yep. I agree with that too. And I think that it's really important. I think we've lost some intentionality with our fast moving culture where we're just getting from A to B. We're saying, hey, how are you doing? That's great. We're moving on to the next conversation versus really sitting with someone, really hearing somebody. It's just even in our own personal lives. If we could just slow down and we could hear people, we could look at them directly, not with a screen in front of us, with the person on the other side, but really be there to hear and see people because just from my own experience with the work that I'm doing, I have heard about loneliness more and more over this last, few years. I could see how it could be possibly tied to that. The intentionality and relationships that we used to have is a little bit less. We're living more online than we are in person. And so I don't think that people are truly feeling seen and heard. And I'm so glad that you touched on that because I think it's important. And so we've got to be better at that. We've got to be better at that, in our own relationships. And I think therapy is a place where you should be able to receive that as well, of course, to be able to be seen and heard truly so that we can best help you and hear you. And you did mention Jungian Sandplay Therapy. Can you touch on that really quick, what that is for people that don't know what Jungian Sandplay Therapy is and how it can really serve as a universal language with non-directive play?
Yes, it's, I wanted to add something to the previous question, but it so nicely moves into exactly what I wanted to add. Because another universal point that what I feel is it really is there throughout, I think, all of our civilizations, is symbolic language. We rely so much on language. We think that our thoughts and what we say is the most important thing in the world. And it is important. And I want to be very clear that I think it is important, but it's not the full story. It's not the whole story at all. And the other piece that I find, having a symbolic language, being able to communicate through symbols is something that, again, it speaks so much throughout, to people throughout cultures. And this brings me to Jungian Sandplay Therapy, which is based on the work of, but in its name, you hear the word Jungian. So it's based on the work of Carl Jung. But it's a fantastic, nonverbal, creative therapy that uses sand, water, and small miniature objects, of anything around us in different parts of the world. And as Dora Koff, who founded this method, used to say that, by having these objects, you environ the world in because you now have representations of the world. And that means having images of this miniature image figurines of anything, people, animals, building, religious objects, natural objects, food, anything at all, And what it does, in working with it in both in the UK and also in Israel, is that it allows for much deeper connection to oneself because we're no longer limited by language. We now have the tactile component because there's sand, which is part of the earth, part of the natural component of where we live on this planet. There is water, and there is the creative ability. There's the playful ability. It helps people to reconnect. And this is an enormously powerful resource. And it helps people to reconnect to it and to be able to see that they have enormously resource within themselves. There is such a rich element, such a rich kind of like a plast of their own being and their own imagination, their own playfulness, their own ideas, their own experiences that is available to them. But of course, they can access it through words because words are very conscious and words are very limiting in many ways. And because an image, a symbol will always have many meanings, right? So if I pick something that's on my table and we can pick this little figure that I just brought from Azerbaijan, wow, that will carry many, many meanings, right? You will have one association to it. I will have a different association to it. There's also what this means in different cultures across the world, and that also has a psychological meaning. So you can communicate so much more by creating an image in the sand. And that image then begins to communicate with you. You begin to relate to this image because you now see some of what you're struggling with, some of what you are kind of connecting to, some of what you're not connecting to that's happening inside of you. All of a sudden, in an image outside of yourself. And unlike art, the image almost like is three-dimensional. It's not art per se. So sometimes people say, oh, art, I don't want to draw, I don't want to paint, I'm not an artist, I don't know how to do it. And, all these sort of feelings and complexes around that kind of kick in. But with sand, it's like, oh, it's just like playing on the sand. In the sand, like playing by the beach, right? Except that it's in a tray of sand, so it has boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And then within that space, people can create.
Yes, and I've never thought about it before, really. I know a lot about sandplay therapy. It's not one of my specialties, but we do have it here with some of our therapists that do play therapy. But I really haven't thought about the universality of it, how you can use that as a universal language to be able to project thoughts, feelings, and emotions and then help people navigate that. That's really fantastic that you do that work. You do such a broad level of work and have so many different specialties. It's very, very impressive. And as a therapist who holds space for so many other people, I mean, you're here for them, their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, their experiences. How do you care for your own emotional and mental wellness? I know I get this question a lot too as a therapist, where people go, is it a lot for you? Do you carry a lot? How do you take care of yourself in the midst of it? So, what about you? Do you have any grounding practices or rituals or self care practices that are your go to?
Yeah, I thought you might ask me that question because, as you say, it's a very common question that we get asked all the
Yeah.
time. Of course, there's some grounding exercise that work for me, and I can talk about them as well, but I want to say I've learned to give myself time to do nothing, nothing, or maybe look through things in my house. If I just want to sit and read, then I sit and read. And we know that it really recharges ourselves. Kids do this very well. Sometimes they do nothing very well. I think we should learn from them. I think we should learn from them. That works very well for me. Doing things that are very completely different from sun play and also therapy in general, like cooking. I love to cook. I think it's very creative. You just look a bunch of different things on the counter and all of a sudden, well, look at this. This is like a transformation happen in an hour. I like to cook. I like to go into nature. I love the water and I love sitting on the sand. I'm that weird person that actually is laying on the sand. I don't want the chair. I need to lay on the sand. And I just feel like it interacts with my body in such a deep, healing, and relaxing way. I love nature. I love all kinds of things. I love going to the mountains. I love skiing. So things that are kind of focused on myself, but also that are very, if you can hear, that kind of very tactile, right? There's sand, the swimming, it's the mountains, it's the skiing, with the cooking. It's also very sensorial, right? So things that are sensorial really work for me. I think because of the emotional space that we hold, also the whole the symbolic language, it's very rich and very stimulating and incredibly exciting. I find that it really helps me to regenerate, is to do those kind of what may sound very basic, but very sensorial thing. I mean, of course, I also meditate and I go to I think I find sports is very important for my well-being, like being physically active, be that going to the gym, playing tennis, whatever. Like that's really important to me. If I don't do it, I really feel very tired very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you can keep your energy up, make sure you're in nature, making sure you're recognizing to your limitations and seeking rest and when you need to and being quiet when you need to. I think Those are really great recommendations and really great things that you do for yourself to take care of your own mental and emotional wellness. And so, finally, as we're kind of wrapping up, you shared so many incredible insights, and I really appreciate your time and your space to come on here today. Where can listeners connect with your work and follow along your journey after they hear you on the podcast?
So I'm available, they can find me on LinkedIn. I have a Facebook professional page, all that's on Instagram. My email available on all of those places that they can email me, of course, and it's probably easiest to email me. My phone number is also available. So really any of the social media links that I just mentioned, but also my website, of course.
Okay, great. If you do have any questions about any of this, please seek out the resources that you have. You can find more information about Hannah-Valeria, in case, like she said on our website, in the show notes. We're going to have all the information and easy access to be able to either connect with her or just read about her work and learn about what she does, because she does so many incredible things for the community around her. So thank you again for coming on. We have talked about potentially having another bonus episode as well and talking about other factors. There's so much to cover. And I know we weren't even able to cover it all today. And so if you would be open to it, I would love to have you back on for another episode.
Of course, with pleasure. It's a pleasure. Really enjoyed talking to you. And as you say, I also feel there's so much more that can be said, but of course, we're always constricted by time. But thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you very much for inviting me. It was really a pleasure.
Yes, a great introduction. And there will be more coming with Hannah-Valeria. So stay tuned. And thank you so much for joining me on Mental Health Without Borders. It's been an incredible conversation today. And I hope as a listener, you found some valuable insights to take with you. Remember, no matter where you are in the world or where you come from, your mental wellness truly matters. So be patient with yourself, take time for your well being, and never forget that seeking help is a sign of strength. I look forward to connecting with you next time on Mental Health Without Borders.